We have had a really impressive group of young students who are working with this project. Over the last 4 years, we've been developing this project. And so I'd like to just make mention, I know that James Baker is here, who's one of those students who's been participating for the last 2 years as one of our primary student researchers. And so I'm glad to have you here. Naomi, who's also one of our seniors in the health exercise and sports studies major. So the topic of neuromechanics of youth league baseball throwing, one of the things that you're probably asking yourself is, what is this thing called neuromechanics? And I can try to say right now that what we're talking about is we're talking about the musculoskeletal system of the body. How does that body move in complex patterns? And particularly, what's the influence of the neurologic system in facilitating those movements? It's an orchestration between the nervous system and the muscular system which makes these movements possible. And trying to understand these movements and the role of the neurologic system is really interesting. There's some fascinating relationships. Today, what I want to do is I want to try to bring up one specific outcome, one specific topic that we've been looking at, okay, with regard to youth league baseball throwing. So what's the problem? The problem with pitching is, if you can imagine 9 to 14-year-old young people, they're participating in a youth league baseball program, and those who participate or make an appearance as a pitcher during the game will go home that evening, and 7% of them will experience or report some sort of an elbow pain. Of those who make an appearance, now notice, I'm not talking about how many pitches they threw. I'm talking about just simply having an appearance as a pitcher. 9% of those children will go home and report some sort of shoulder pain. Now, when you think about these numbers, I got to remind you that when you experience pain, pain was one of the cardinal signs of inflammation. Inflammation is a result of some sort of a trauma to the structures of the body. So when we say that 7% or 9% of children go home and have experienced pain after throwing a baseball, we're talking about some level of trauma that's to the arm structure itself. Now that sounds like it's not so bad. We're used to experiencing this type of pain after exercise, but let me caution you that of those children who are pitchers in a youth league baseball program, within 10 years, 5% of those children will experience an injury to the arm structure that's sufficient enough to require surgical techniques. If not surgical techniques, then it's sufficient to require that they no longer participate in the game of baseball. And we multiply these what may feel like a smaller percentage, but we have to multiply that against all those individuals who are participating in youth league baseball. And there's no really good estimate for this, because you may think that Little League is the only organization for youth baseball, but it's not. There's Dixie League, there's all sorts of youth league baseball programs that are around the country, but the best estimate that I've seen right now is that about 6 million young people each year participate in the game of baseball at a youth league level. That is to say, something less than 14 years old in this case I'm speaking to. I really need to invest in a clicker so I don't have to walk around the podium, right? So what's the problem with adults? We know the problem with pitching. There seems to be something about pitching which results in pain and trauma to the arm structure. So I got to ask the question, what's wrong with the adults? What's the problem with the adults? Well, the first thing I got to say is, if we consider individuals 14 to 20 years old, those who are averaging 80 pitches per game, then their risk of or chance of having to have surgery goes up by nearly quadruples the probability. If we look at the pitching competitively for more than 8 months or 8 months a year, right, their risk of experiencing a surgery to the arm structure goes up 5-fold. And the one that really is quite frightening, to be honest with you, is those who regularly pitch with arm fatigue. The risk or the odds that they are going to have surgery at some point go up 36 times. So the question is, we see that workload clearly matters to the experience of the young person, and clearly matters relative to the types of injuries that they experience, right? Now, so workload matters. And so we think of youth league baseball as a group of young people who get together in a community and they play some smaller number of games each year, perhaps 20, perhaps 15 to 20 games a year. And that has historically been the case, but in recent years, one of the things we've noticed is all of youth league baseball has increased their schedules. And so now young people are starting to play 30, 35 games a year. And it's not just 30 or 35 games a year, but there's this emergence of a phenomenon called travel baseball. In fact, travel youth sports, in case you've ever heard of it. In fact, those who study sports sometimes talk about this phenomenon called tournication. Have you ever heard of tournication? Tournication is where families will schedule their vacation around youth league tournaments. And so if you pay attention, it happens, right? And so we not only have the community youth league baseball, but we also have these travel teams that are emerging. And if we ask the question that came up with the citation I provide, is they asked the children and their families, which teams do you participate on? And those who report being a baseball pitcher, 25% of them report that they participate not just on their little league, but a team, but also on a travel team. So now the question becomes, well, what about, how does that relationship work, where they're on two separate teams and two separate leagues with regard to workload? Well, I brought one thing up. Little League, recognizing that workload matters, Little League some years ago came up with a series of regulations as to how many pitches a pitcher can throw and then the subsequent number of days that rest they would need. So if a child, for instance, throws 66 pitches, then they are going to require 4 separate calendar days of rest. But if you're on both and by the way, if you're a coach on the Little League, you abide by those rules. But if that pitcher is also participating on a travel team, what's the probability that the two coaches are going to coordinate the pitching schedule for that child? Right? We see the problem. They may have great intentions, but the reality is the communication between these two adults is going to fail. And so the pitching schedule for the young person in Little League is not communicated to the travel team, and the travel team's pitching is not communicated to the Little League. And so we see that these young people are having elevated workloads. And when they have elevated workloads, then we see the increased probability of having an injury sufficient enough to require surgical intervention. So what are our options, right? By the way, I scheduled this so that I spend about 10 minutes talking here and then 10 minutes on the next subject, okay? What are our options? Our options are simple. We can manage workload, right? Little League has attempted to do that. We can record pitch charts. In fact, you probably hear about pitch charts if you watch Major League Baseball. Major League Baseball is becoming, because you're talking about these individuals who command multi-million-dollar contracts, we're paying very close to how much workload those pitchers are experiencing. We don't necessarily do that with children readily. We can do better at managing workload. We can be attentive to the arm of our young people and the expressions that they have relative to their arms. Kids will sometimes try to shield us from knowing how their arm truly feels. And so one other thing we can do is we can be attentive to how they're throwing and the way they carry their arm. And if an adult actually recognizes that a child is throwing in a different way, or if they're displaying images or characteristics of a slower arm or a fatigued arm, then the adult can do what I think is reasonable and rational, and that is to say, remove that child from participating for a while until that child can rest. We can do better at that, right? The third thing that we can do, and this is where we come in, this group of Doctors Doty, Lott, myself, and our many students between the physics and the health, exercise, and sports studies major, is we want to be able to understand better and teach more optimal biomechanics of the throw. Now, I should have done this beforehand. So the question is, there's a paragraph up here, and I can tell you, you guys are enjoying a lunch. The last thing you want to do is have to read a paragraph about biomechanics, okay? So what I did was, I want you just to enjoy this, and I'm gonna summarize it for you, right? The kinetic chain model of throwing. This is the model that we are working on. We're establishing our work based on this model, and so we have to have an understanding of what this model is and what it says. In essence, what it says is the kinetic chain model of throwing views the body as a series of interconnected segments. During the act of overhead throwing, there should be a sequence of segmental acceleration from the foot all the way through the last finger that's in contact with the ball. Acceleration of one segment providing the energy that's used to facilitate the acceleration of each subsequent segment. Much like a series of springs. If you can imagine one segment rotating, which stretches the next segment, which then is loading it, preloading it for its rotation, its acceleration. So much like a series of springs. In this way, the high mass segments of the pelvis and the upper thorax can provide much of the energy necessary to accelerate the arm during the pitch. Failure of these large mass segments to provide effective energy transfer to the arm will, in effect, orphan the arm, and the throwing arm is left to violently accelerate in isolation. So in other words, what we want to do is we want from the ground all the way up through the middle finger, if you will. We want each segment to contribute to the energy that is used to accelerate the subsequent segment. Now, that requires extraordinary neurologic control. My colleague, right, Dr. Martinez, studies motor behavior, right, motor pattern behaviors, and you understand the extraordinary orchestration that has to take place in such a small time for such complicated movements. And so we have to ask, well, how are we going to measure this? So in our study, what we do is we take infrared reflectors and we place them on 56 different bony locations on the body. In recognition that these movements happen in these, I call micro moments, right? We have to have high-speed videography. And so we'll have this in Dr. Lott's lab, we'll have a pulsing infrared energy, which is reflected back to the camera and recorded. And so as time progresses, we can have a three-dimensional model as to where each segment of the body is. Now, having done that, what we can do is we can focus our attention on any one segment or any two segments and see how they're moving on one another. Okay? Now, in this talk, what I'm going to be I'll be presenting are appreciably 4 of these reflectors. We'll have one reflector on each of the 2 acromioclavicular articulations, the bump on your shoulder. We'll have 2 infrared reflectors on the crest of the iliac, right here on the sides of your hip. Okay? I'm not going to pay attention to the other 52 reflectors today. Okay? Because we're talking about the X angle. Okay? The X angle. The X angle, it's the angle of separation between the pelvis and the upper thorax within the transverse plane. The transverse plane is a plane that cuts you into upper and lower halves. And so effectively, when we talk about the separation of the pelvis and the thorax, we're talking about rotation like this. And I'm not a good model, but it's also rotation where my pelvis is stable and my thorax is moving, rotating like that. Okay? Now, Trent Edmonds here at Denison, who I think of as being a really extraordinary artist, right? What I did was I sent him a file with all of these data markers. And what he did was he took all of that data and he put a skin over it so he could create an animation, right? In fact, a movie of how this person moves according to our measurements of this data reflection, or this infrared reflective data. So what you see up here is Trent's model of actually one of the young people who threw for us this year, okay? But what you see also is we put what appears to be two 4x6 lumber, one through the upper segment of the thorax and one through the segment of the pelvis. And what you should see here is there's no separation between the thorax and the pelvis. Do you see that? The two are in line with one another. What we want to see is a separation of those two to where it almost appears as an X, which is why we call it the X angle. Okay, so let's see what happens. Oh, by the way, the X angle here is 0 because there is no separation. If I scroll down one more, look at this. This is the young person. Remember, this is a young person who, I believe this is an 11-year-old who threw for us. What's the first thing you notice about this real data? This is where their body segments are in space as they begin their throw. The thing that you notice is that there's no X, right? The two lines are parallel. There's no separation. The X angle is 0. But you should also notice that the child is bending over as they begin their throw. Young people have really immature, inexperienced motor patterns, which is the root of our concern relative to their arm health. Here's a young person who's bending over, and there is no X angle, it's 0. Here, the young person is in the middle of this acceleration leading up to the terminal phase where the ball is released. And if you notice here, we should see a maximum X angle at this place. We should see a large separation between the thorax and the pelvis. Where the thorax is pointed directly at the catcher, and their pelvis should be nearly oriented directly at the catcher as well. A large separation, a large X. Don't see it. X angle is still 0 here. Which tells you what? It tells you that the arm is orphaned effectively. The arm, in order to accelerate, is going to have to establish the energy of acceleration unto itself, which is traumatic. Do this 80 times, and we can start to understand why the structures involved begin to break down. Now here is a young person, right? And he's one of our college players who threw for us, right? And what we see is the X angle develops in 2 stages. There's a slow loading phase. And the slow loading phase is when the thorax is being held stable. The lead leg is in the air, and it's starting to move towards the plate. The pelvis will start to move, reorienting itself towards the catcher, but the thorax is held stable. The X angle slowly increases in magnitude. Okay? This is one of those moments where the crisis is, are you still understanding where we're at? It's a slow loading phase. Okay? Now I want you to imagine, notice that I captured this image. It was really good. You should have seen me in my office. I was clicking, trying to capture just the right moment, right? And I captured his foot just before it hit the ground. That's when the slow loading stage finishes. Because as soon as his foot touches the ground, his lead foot plants into the ground, we're going to see a rotation occur at the pelvis that's very quick. You can imagine that the ground reaction force is happening as the foot plants. It's going to drive up through the leg, taking the glove side hip and pushing it backwards. At the same time, his drive leg, his back foot, you see it driving off of the pitching rubber. That drive leg is going to be driving the hip on the throwing side forward. And so as soon, there's a slow load, and as soon as the foot strikes the ground, we see this rapid reorientation of the pelvis, and ideally we should see that the thorax is held constantly stable. In fact, if you look at this young man's upper thorax, you see him disciplined in how he holds his thorax. It's closed, allowing the pelvis to rotate. By the way, I've decided to change the order of the presentation. I want you to try to envision the establishment of the X angle in this professional pitcher. This is a Columbus Clippers pitcher. Watch it again. Watch it again. How many of you could see the X angle be established? If you could, you're impressive. Right? Why? Because your eyes are being drawn to two places simultaneously within just a small segment of time. You have to see the pelvis rotate, and you have to be looking at the upper thorax. And the time that it takes to do that is extraordinarily small. But if you watch pictures much, you can start to get a feel for what this person's X angle is doing. And this person has a really nice to be honest with you, I think it looks really nice. But he's a professional pitcher. So, there we go. Now, remember the kinetic chain model of throwing. It says that as one segment rotates, the other segment will be loaded, and then the subsequent acceleration will occur by the energy from the previous segment. Okay? Now, what's really interesting is that our bodies, our neurologic system, have this really cool reflex, which is designed to facilitate just such a maneuver. Okay? It's called the stretch reflex and reciprocal inhibition. Okay? Stretch reflex and reciprocal inhibition. So let's talk about the muscles that are involved in maintaining this rotational position. It's the external obliques. The external obliques you see up here, if you look as you're looking at it, the right side, you'll see a muscle which wraps around from the lateral aspect of the body towards the midline. Almost like the fibers are like your hands going into your vest. Okay, that's the glove side external oblique. There's a throwing side external oblique also. So the left side external oblique, when it acts unilaterally, rotates my body to the opposite side. When my throwing side or right side external oblique contracts, it rotates my body to the left side. Okay? So remember what I said was that it's a series of springs, loading and unloading. Okay? The neurologic reflex, called the stretch reflex, says this: if I take a muscle and I rapidly elongate that muscle, there will be a neurologic stimulation that reaches the spinal cord and perhaps is modified up in the motor cortex, but primarily at the spinal cord level, in which there's going to be an action potential passed back to the muscle, and that muscle which is being elongated now begins to contract. Now, how do I make you see this? How do I help you see this? Well, I can tell you, my traditional method of doing this is if I wanted to touch the ceiling, if I wanted to jump high enough to touch the ceiling, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stretch my quadriceps so that I can then have a powerful contraction upward, the stretch reflex. At the same time that I have this stretch reflex, right? So in context, when I'm holding my trunk back and my pelvis is rotating forward, my throwing side oblique, external oblique, is being rapidly elongated, which should then cause this throwing side external oblique to become stimulated. At the same time that this muscle is becoming stimulated, there's going to be a reciprocal inhibition of the antagonistic muscle. In this case, the glove side external oblique. In other words, if we rapidly elongate a muscle, that muscle which is being elongated will contract, and that muscle which is causing that elongation to occur will be inhibited. Stretch reflex and reciprocal inhibition. Dr. Lott, may I ask what time it is? Okay, so I need, okay, right? So here's a graph of an x angle as it progresses. What you see on the x-axis would be time, and what you see on the y-axis is the magnitude of the x angle. Remember I said that there is a slow load phase and there's a rapid load phase. One of the things that we were able to see when we actually did the analysis and we did the x angle graphing is we can actually visually see, just visually see, that there's a slow load and a rapid load, right? And we can actually calculate the slow load and the rapid load. Well, that's awkward. My alarm's saying stop talking, right? There's a slow load and a rapid load. Now notice that the magnitude of the x angle approaches in this one person, approaches 40 degrees, which is really pretty good. But I want you to focus on the magnitude of the slope early versus the magnitude of the slope as it steeply increases to its maximum. By the way, the other side of that graph is the transit as we start to throw the ball. Okay, so we're focusing on the first half of this graph for today. Right, so what did we find? Well, we found that we had a group of 12 young male baseball players. The average age in this group was something approaching 14 years. Okay, the range was between 11 and 16, right? The height, you see the height. These are young people, right? Each one of these young people offered a number of pitches. So we had a total of 39 pitches in this data set. Okay, so what did we find? Well, the average x maximum, the maximal x angle that we observed, when we look at the average, it was about 45, 46 degrees, which, to be quite honest with you, is really quite good. It's really quite good. It seems that the children can actually rotate the pelvis and the thorax in sequence. Okay? The range, you see the range, right? What's the duration of this rapid load? The duration of time over which the rapid load occurs is, what, 1300ths of a second? That's how quick this is? And the question is it fast enough? It feels fast enough. When we talk taking a muscle and we elongate it within a duration of, what, 1300ths of a second? It feels like it should be fast enough to elicit the stretch reflex. Okay? What's the slope of the two, right? The slope of the rapid load versus the slow load, however, is about 3 times, right? So the rapid load slope, right? The rapid load phase slope is about 3 times the slope of the slow load phase. So I say to you, it's as if I'm walking slowly and then I walk 3 times faster. It's still pretty slow. Okay? And there's the range. Now, you see that one of the young people had a slope differential, right? A slope ratio, rapid to slow, of 16. So some children are able to establish this rapid loading of the thorax and the pelvis really quickly. But a lot of the children are not. Okay? Now, what does this mean? So I'm going to sum it up with this. The other thing that we did was we looked at the neurologic aspect, and so we put surface electromyograph over the external obliques. And we wanted to see when did these two muscles, the glove side external oblique and the throwing side external oblique, when did they reach their peak amplitude in terms of neurologic activity? Now, according to the kinetic chain model of throwing, when it's most optimal, we should see that the glove side external oblique reaches a peak early, and then the throwing side external oblique reaches a peak. As the throwing side external oblique reaches a peak, we should see that the glove side external oblique would be more nearly silent. So in other words, these two muscles should have a sequencing of activation, peak activation. Does that make sense? What did we find? We actually found that the glove side and the throwing side achieved their peak amplitude at almost the exact point in time. They were separated by 1,000th of a second. In other words, they were co-contracting. These two muscles were co-activated, which is not consistent with the stretch reflex or the reciprocal inhibition, which tells us that the slope ratio, rapid to slow, of 3 is inadequate, and we need to have a rapid load duration, which is shorter than 1300ths of a second. And appreciably, what we see is we see children who are capable of moving and establishing the motor pattern, but they do so slowly, which effectively decreases their capacity to draw on this innate motor pattern reflex. So the question is, how do we go about helping the children to establish that neuromuscular or that neuropattern facilitation, right? Now, I have a couple students this year who are doing a senior year experience on some exercises which may facilitate that. So hopefully we'll have some results soon. Okay? I'll stop with that. Questions?